Hello and welcome to a deck profile / tournament report. We just got back from BCS Sacramento, the first big event of the season, and me and Eugene, my test partner, managed to cook up a new variant of Shiranui. Eugene in particular made the big recommendations that really transformed this list into what it is now. A week before the tournament, so we had to scramble like madmen to get enough practice to make sure it was actually good. But the two of us played the exact same list, and he managed to take it into top cut, whereas I went X2 and bubbled out. But he had a really strong performance and proved that this list is really solid. I think it's our strongest iteration of Crest Shiranui yet. I'm really excited to show it to you. We did get a top, so of course the deck list is not secret anymore. Without any further ado, let's get into the changes. First, we have our starter, Stealth Dragon Madoy. Play the V version because it gets a quick shield and it always draws a card regardless of whether you went first or second. And you have to play a starter named Stealth Dragon Madoy for the Crest. Next, we have our grade 3s, and we are starting off with 4 copies of Shiranui Oboro, as always. This is the only Vanguard that goes into the History Collection Stride, which has been eroded, so that you go into this and then you can Superior Stride into this in the main phase and get 2 Protect markers and get a on-hit that always activates on your Stride, which is really strong. And on top of that, it has pretty decent effects on its own. It gets a Dominate attack when you Stride over it, which is a really strong effect. It's just 1 free attack. And then it also can force the opponent to call a unit from drop at the beginning of ride phase. So you can, of course, force your opponent to give you Dominate targets. Next up, we have 2 copies of Blazing Demon Stealth Dragon Shiranui Zonki. It's been eroded to be Demon Stealth Dragon, so this is one of the only legal ride targets you can go into with the Crest, because the Crest restricts you to riding only Demon Stealth Dragons. This is a really strong effect. On place or on Stride, you get to choose a unit and give it 2k, and if you pick an opponent's unit, you get to dominate it, which just gives you 2 free attacks on the turn you play this, because you play it and then Stride over it in the same turn. And then at the beginning of ride phase, you can Soul Blast 1, force both players to draw, or force both players to call, and you draw a card. So you get a little bit of cycling to dig deeper into your deck for attackers, and more importantly, you get to strip a card out of the opponent's hand and force them to give you a dominate target. So this is a really strong card in the late game, but we don't want to see it early because we want to go into this first and go into History Collection Stride, and if we have copies of this, it'll stop us from G-assisting, so we can only play 2 copies. You could even consider cutting this down to 1 or cutting all copies of this. This card is not super important. It just helps in a few matchups and gives you extra grade 3s to ride into or pitch to Stride. Next is our grade 2s, and we're starting things off with 4 copies of Stealth Dragon Seingeki, one of the most important cards in the deck. This has the ride fixer effect that that every clan got in V. At the beginning of ride phase, you can, if you're on grade 1 or less, you can discard this card and check top 5 for a grade 2 or less card and add it to hand and then shuffle. So this importantly helps us find copies of Stealth Dragon Seizui to make sure we always get the Crest. And then when this attacks while boosted, you can Soul Blast 1, and if your opponent has 4 or more cards, you make them discard a card. So we can keep the opponent from plussing too hard. We can make them make painful decisions. Against bad players, they'll mess up and they'll discard their Quick Shields or Guardian Shields, which will allow us to really mess them up with Rene later in the game. But in this new version of the deck, we have fewer boosters to play. So we do not get this Soul Blast effect as often. We are more interested in using this to check the top 5 for cards. In fact, I will discard pretty much any copies I draw early to make sure I find the Crest or any other useful cards on the deck. Next, we have 3 copies of World Shaper Stealth Rogue Shoujudoji. This is the grade 2 of the Shoujudoji ride line. You're familiar with this card from Standard probably, but if not, what it does is when it's all placed on V, you check the top 5, you pick 2 normal units with Stealth, and the first one goes to Soul, and you call the rest. That's important because if you only hit 1 Stealth normal unit, you have to Soul Charge it. But this just helps us build Soul for our late game costs. This helps us dig in the top 5 for important pieces, and it can help us build a board for early rush. All of those are great things to have. And then this is essentially a vanilla every turn after turn 2. So you can discard it to protect markers or to costs, or you can just call it. And the fact that we have a Crest giving us 5k power for every face card in the G zone means that it'll still be decent even though it's a vanilla. Overall, it's the best ride target. It's the one you should try to keep in your hand if you can early, because it's the best thing to ride into on turn 2, and it'll help you find everything else you need. Next, we have 3 copies of Evil Stealth Dragon Yamashibuki, and this is the first major departure from the old version of the list. This card is really solid. It does a lot of things for us. One, it gets 5k for every grade 0 rear guard we have, so it can become a big attacker, or it can do this other thing where when it attacks you, counterblast 1, you return another rear guard in your hand, you call up to 2 evil decoys, which means it'll fuel its own effect. Evil decoys are a grade 0. That means it powers up that effect, and they're 5k shield, and they can intercept. They have the intercept symbol instead of the boost symbol, so keep that in mind. They can't attack, and they can intercept from the back row. So this can help us build defensive power as well as offensive power, because it gives itself power, and it gives us additional shield in play. It gives grade 0s, which means that it can fuel one of our more important strides, Giacomesso, which we couldn't play in previous iterations of this list, but we can play again now. So it does a lot for us, but it costs counterblast, which means that you now are encouraged to take some early swings, whereas before you were encouraged to guard as much as possible. And it makes the counterblast management slightly more challenging in this deck. But overall, it's a net gain to the power level of Shiranui, so it's worth playing. And this has always been a card that's been worth considering, and it's just always been slightly edged out by Shoujo Doji for me. But whereas before we were building this deck to try to survive against Katrina and to have the best chance of beating that deck, this new version is calculated to beat Grand Blue. And so playing this gives you more game against Grand Blue. Next up, we have our Restanders, 4 copies of Furai. A major departure from the previous list. I have long been a proponent of playing 5 to 6 Restanders in Shiranui and Premium, but we simply don't have the space right now, and I'm looking at things we could cut to make room for 1 or 2 more copies of Sekie in order to play the old Restander count, but I just haven't found the space yet. But this card is the better of the 2 Restanders. It's the more aggressive. It gets 5k power for every time a unit dominated attacked, so it can scale better into the late game, and it can give us early pressure. So it's the better one to play in this list. Because we're only playing 4 Restanders, you now must value these much more highly. You must try to protect them and avoid discarding them and avoid getting them killed by the opponent's incidental board control effects. So, because we're only playing 4 of these now, our deck has fewer dead cards against decks that can deny us all dominate targets, such as Grand Blue, which will help us in those matchups. And we still have access to 4 Restanders, so we can still set up the double Restander 5 attack turn if need be. Next, we have our grade 1s, and we're starting things off with the most important grade 1, 4 copies of Stealth Dragon Seizui. This is the card that makes the Crest, and the Crest is how we win. The Crest gives you 5k power to the front row for every face card in the G-Zone, which means that the longer the game goes on, the more devastating your board gets, to the point that eventually you can just checkmate your opponent and they can't guard anything. So we want to see this every game, so we're playing the maximum 4 copies. I do not recommend playing any fewer than 4 copies, no matter what anybody tells you. If you're going to play the Crest at all, play 4. Next, we have 3 copies of Katari Gitsune, and this is another major departure from the list. We are playing more copies of this than in the old version. The reason for that is that the more we played the deck, the more we realized we never want to ride any grade 1 except Seizui. And so playing backup ride targets was foolish in this sense, because it was playing for the bad scenario instead of playing for our best scenario. And the Crest is surprisingly consistent. You can get it probably in close to 80% of your games if you mulligan super aggressively for it and you play correctly. And that includes mulliganing all grade 1s away so that you can G-assist for it if you can't draw it in your opening hand. That being said, this card gave us the other biggest problem the deck had besides not getting Crest is not getting a Boro on turn 3. And playing 3 copies of this gives us the highest chance of getting a Boro on turn 3. And importantly, because we are playing Shoujo Doji as a ride target, and we are playing Yamashibuki, you can get the 3-card combo of ride Shoujo Doji, and if the top 5 has a Katari Gitsune, you can call it, and then you can bounce to hand with Yamashibuki in order to search for a grade 3 on your next turn. This cannot necessarily save you if you don't have a grade 3 already, but it can help you get the second grade 3 in order to pitch to History Collection, because these are superior stride effects, and so you're paying the cost for an act ability, not for the cost of stride. So the stride crit and other cards that count as a grade 3 when paying the cost of stride will not fulfill the conditions for the History Collection strides. But this card can also discard to search for our grade 3s, and thus we can pay for it with 1 card that way, as well as getting some nice deck thinning. Next, we have 2 copies of Stealth Dragon Megetsu. This is a new addition to the deck. These are the promos that can pitch as heal triggers for the cost of G-Guardian, and they have a nice little defensive effect as well when you guard with them normally. Having access to more G-Guardians is really strong because of 2 things. One, we have a really powerful G-Guardian in the form of Morilord. This card is really good. And second, we are a Crest deck, so every face-up card in the G-Zone will give us more power. So getting more G-Guardians means that we can get to our late-game win con even faster. And then the other effect of this is when you guard with it from hand, you remove a heal from drop from the game or from your hand, and this unit gets plus 10k for every 2 cards in your opponent's hand. Plus 10k shield, that is. Which replicates the effect of Morilord, which is our best G-Guardian again. This will hit basically the same amount of defensive power as our best G-Guardian, and it can do it without G-Guardianing, without being a G-Guardian. So against decks like Mega Colony, this is really strong. And then you can counterblast 1 and give your Vanguard 5k, which can be nice against decks with multi-attack in order to make sure that you just hit, especially if you hit a defensive, you can make sure you're just slightly over the number they need to hit you. So this is a really strong card. It's good at, especially in the late game, but it's okay in the mid game as well because we can just use it to G-Guard. It's just not very good in the early game. But that's why we only play 2 copies, alongside the fact that we want to keep the number of grade 1s in the deck low so we can G-Assist for Seizui more often. But it's really solid to play, and again, we can call it with Shoujo Doji and then bounce it with Yamashibuki or with Jakumeso in order to get it into our hand for the late game. And then another big change is 2 copies of Stealth Dragon Utsuroi. This is the recyclable perfect card. When a dominate attack hits, if you have 2 of these in your drop, you can put 1 on the bottom and 1 into your hand, which is just a very good effect. We can basically guarantee that a dominate attack will hit if we go into Mukuro, because Mukuro will dominate the Vanguard and attack the opponent's entire board. So one of those Vanguard attacks will hit. The opponent is not going to spend their entire hand guarding their entire board, and if they do, you probably just won the game. So we can guarantee set this up when we have 2 copies in the drop zone. On top of that, it is a stealth normal unit, so we can call it off Shoujo Doji and then bounce it to hand with Yamashibuki or Jakumeso, which is another great way to farm extra defensive power. And it's a grade 1 perfect guard, which helps it get around certain other effects. We can use these against specifically Oracle Think Tank, not against the Popo, but against the Vanguard swing. Against Popo, you can only guard with Elementaria and other Blitz orders. It's the only way out of that situation. But just having these also gives us one more big change, which is that we're able to play 2 more crits, since we're no longer playing 2 draw 2 PGs in this spot. And those 2 more crits will increase the deck's power ceiling. You'll get free wins slightly more often when the opponent no guards or history collection stride, because sometimes you'll just hit crit or crit and kill them. That'll happen just slightly more often than it would otherwise. You'll also just push for more damage in the early game slightly more often. All those times you hit a draw trigger, instead you'll be hitting a critical trigger in the early game. And we are playing the GB1 Soul Crits, which I'll get to later, so we have some more resource generation. However, we have still kept the same amount of perfect guards in the deck because we aren't playing crit sentinels. So we are keeping the defensive power roughly the same while increasing the offensive power of the deck. Next, we are playing 1 copy of Elementaria. This is just the best perfect guard in the game. It gets around various guard restrict effects because it's a blitz order. It pitches for a free perfect guard effect, basically because in premium, everyone is striding, which means everyone is triple drive. So this is just a really solid card, and you have to have a very good justification for not playing this in premium. And then we have 1 copy of Bracing Angel Ladder. This will help us protect our units from certain defensive plays, like Denial Griffin or the Cannoneer Beatrice combo out of Grand Blue. And that will ensure that we can finish off the opponent, because one of the ways to beat Crest decks in the late game is to play Denial Griffin effects to essentially guard 2 attacks with 1 card. By killing a unit, you no longer have to deal with the giant power it got from Crest. So playing Bracing Angel Ladder can help us slam the door shut on the opponent and finish them off without them having any way to interact with us. On top of that, it builds soul and draws a card, so at the very least it always replaces itself, and it's a grade 3, so we can pitch it to stride in matchups where it doesn't do anything. Next up is our triggers, and we're playing 3 of the grade 3 heal and 1 of the grade 0 countercharge heal. These can pay for stride, and they have a good anti-early rush effect where they give you 10k or they give something -2 crit. So they're just very good to play to stem the early bleeding. And then this heal, Kesara Basara, gives you the ability to bind it itself and another heal from drop when you G-Guardian with it, and either countercharge or soul charge. Now that we're playing Yamshibuki, we countercharge more than soul charge, but just having a little bit of additional resource generation on something that doesn't really take up a deck slot is really, really strong. So we're glad to play exactly one copy of this. This deck has no resource problems whatsoever. If you play correctly, you should never run out of Counterblast or Soul. So playing this is just like exactly the right amount of resource generation that we need. If you're running into resource problems, you probably just need to change how you play. Next up is 4 copies of the Stride crit. This helps us pay for Stride, and it's a 10k shield, or 15k shield, 10k power, so it's just one of the best crits you can play. Then next up is Stealth Dragon Noroi. This is the History Collection draw crit. Again, these have been updated, so they're 10k power, 15k shield, making them on par with other triggers, and they draw a card when you hit them defensively. And when your Vanguard attacks, if it has Shiranui in its name, which it always will for our deck, you can put this into Soul and draw a card and give your Vanguard 5k. So these will help us build Soul for our restanders and other costs. It'll help us give it a little bit of additional power. It's a nice little thing to have, and we want to play as many crits as possible. And then next we have 2 copies of Stealth Dragon Yamisaki. These are the new additions to the deck. These are the GB1 crits. When your Vanguard attacks, you put these into Soul, draw a card, and your Vanguard gets 10k. So these are really good, specifically with Giacomesso, because Giacomesso will gain a crit, and we can just pressure the opponent harder. And by playing these now, we have 10 crits, which greatly improves our trigger ratios, so we are just slightly more likely to kill the opponent out of nowhere and sack them than we would otherwise. And that's really strong in a deck like this, because if your opponent has exactly enough to like survive this turn that you're on and make it to the next turn, then they can kill you before you really get your crest going, but then sometimes this will just kill them a turn before they thought they were safe. And then we have 1 draw PG because we still only have 3 Sentinels in the deck besides this, and there's not really room to play another grade 1 Sentinel in the main deck, and we don't want to play a crit Sentinel because they're not perfect cards. So just 1 draw PG. This also slightly increases the chance of us hitting a draw on defense, so it keeps the numbers and ratios still pretty good. And then lastly, we have the Dragon Empire Overtrigger, the best Overtrigger in the game, in my opinion. You know it's the best because they keep designing decks that don't work with it, so therefore it clearly must be the best. Lol JK. But this is really good in this deck because if you have a Vanguard and a Restander, Furai is not once per turn. Furai triggers when the Vanguard swings. That is the restriction on when it can restand. So if you can restand your Vanguard with the Overtrigger, you can get another Furai swing. And you can put the 100 million here, swing with Furai, swing with Vanguard, restand, swing with Furai. And you can get the most value out of this. That makes turns where you hit the Overtrigger with the Furai basically unsurvivable for the opponent. They have to have a lot of perfect cards to not die. That's the main deck, so let's get into the G-Zone. We are starting things off with 2 copies of the History Collection Stride. Get out Suricon. This has been errata so that it has the main phase skill that you can stride into this for discarding a grade 3 if you're on Shiranui and you don't have an imaginary gift. And then the on hit will always activate, and the on hit is the opponent discards a card. So this is really good for smoothing the deck out into the mid game. It strips the opponent of resources, and if you hit Overtrigger on this turn, you get to make them discard a second card, which is really strong. Really solid Stride. We're going to go into it basically every turn 3, regardless of whether we went first or second, with few exceptions. And next we have 4 copies of Rine. This is the best Stride in Nubatama in a vacuum, but situations can make this better or worse. This is the effect that you can counterblast 1 and choose a face-down card with the same name and turn it face up, and your opponent chooses 2 cards in their hand and calls them, and then you give them 5k and dominate them. Notably, it only chooses the cards when they're in their hand, so this does get around things like ladder, because the cards are not chosen once they're in play, so they're chosen in a zone where they don't have protection. And then this has GB3, all dominated units get plus 10k and a crit. So on the 2 units that you call with this effect, they're going to be plus 5, plus 10, and then plus 5 from your crest for a total of plus 20 and a crit, which is really strong, and it makes even a trigger guard be forced to guard with a 15k shield minimum. And that is really good for stripping cards out of the opponent's hand. And if your opponent calls low power cards, That generally means they're calling high shield value cards, and thus they're forced to guard them with the low value shield cards that they kept in hand. And if they called low shield value cards, then they kept the triggers in hand, then that means that they are guarding bigger attacks. You potentially get an extra card out of their hand that way. So this can often strip more than just the 2 it forces them to call. It can often strip up to 6 cards out of their hand easily. But it has a weakness. If your opponent calls things like Blitz orders, Normal orders, or the Quick Shield, or the Guardian Shield, or Protect markers, those cards will not exist as rear guards. They cease to exist once they touch R. They're not allowed to exist in that zone. And so you don't get the Dominate attack for those cards that they called. So you need to keep track of your opponent's hand. If you saw them drive check orders, you need to not go into the stride and go into something else. If you know they have the Quick Shield and Guardian Shield still in their hand, you need to go into something else, or you need to calculate whether just getting those 2 cards out of their hand is good enough. This means that Rene is kind of weak to Protect clans, because Protect clans will always have perfect guards in hand that they can call and fizzle the effect of Rene. And so you have to play the Giacomesso for Protect clans. But if your opponent doesn't have fake cards in hand that die to this effect, you can really punish them, and oftentimes the first Rene is enough to kill the opponent. The second Rene almost always kills them. And then next we have 2 copies of Giacomesso. This is the stride that combos with Yamashibuki. When it attacks, you retire 2 grade 0s, and then you can draw 2 cards, bounce all your rear guards to hand, and then you can call 2 cards, and this unit gets 10k and a crit. It also flips something up in the G zone. So this is a really good stride to go into when you have evil decoy tokens in play from Yamashibuki's effect. You don't need Counterblast for any of these effects, or Soul Blast, so you can go into this without spending any resources. It gets 10k and a crit and draws 2 cards while also generating 5 attacks, so it can pressure the opponent while generating resources, which is really nice. This is one of the best strides for surviving into the late game because it draws 2 cards. And it is really good against the aforementioned decks that can beat Rene, specifically, because this does not rely on Dominate or anything like that. So decks with no dominatable targets and decks that can call markers and imaginary gifts to fizzle Rene's effect, we can just go into Giacomesso twice, and that should get us into the late game where our Crest power can win the game for us. And then next we have our utility package. We have 1 copy of Mukuro. Mukuro is a Soul Blast to discard a card, turn a card from the G-Zone face up, and then you can dominate the Vanguard and make it swing at their entire board. Most effects that grant resist do not grant the Vanguard resist, so a lot of decks that have the plan of presenting a board with all resist units to beat Shiranui's effects will simply just lose to Mukuro. Mukuro getting that 1 dominate will turn on our Furais, which is enough to open up our whole turn. And this will also perform 2 drive checks if we dominate a grade 3, so we can get a little bit of extra value and potentially put crits on our restanders, which is really nice. So you need to use this card wisely, especially against Grand Blue. You can use it anytime you have the double restander play, especially when coupled with Ladder to shut down the opponent's defensive options, and you can sneak in a turn with Dominates when they don't expect it. It also is one of our few strides that doesn't cause Counterblast, so you can go into this when you're being damage denied. Next, we have 1 copy of Sukumorikan. We don't need 2 of this anymore because we are playing 2 Giacomesso, but a second copy would still be really strong. What this does is on place, you Counterblast 2 and turn a card from the G-Zone face up, and you make your opponent bind all but 4 cards in their hand, and then at the end of turn, they get those cards back. So this is another way to win when the opponent has a ton of cards in hand. You can just restrict them down to 4 cards, and if they don't have G-Guardians, it can be really hard to survive a 5-attack turn with 2 restanders on only 4 cards, especially when you have high Crest power or if the opponent's at 5 damage. So you go into this as a closer, and you have to pick your moment well because it costs 2 CB, so it's going to devour your resources. And then we have Rokushiki Rakan, which is the GBH stride. This is another closer. You can go into this in different scenarios than Sukumorikan, often in cases where they don't quite have enough cards to justify this Counterblast 2, or in cases where you don't have 2 CB. What this card does is when your opponent's unit is placed on G from hand, you can Counterblast or Soul Blast 1, and if you do, your opponent chooses 2 cards from hand and discards them. So this lets us spend any resource to force the opponent to discard. If the opponent does not have G-Guardians but does have Perfect Guards, this can punish them because we'll be stripping 4 cards out of hand for each Perfect Guard because they'll discard 1 for the cost of the Perfect Guard itself and then 2 additional cards. So this can run us run the opponent out of all their cards really easily and leave them either dead or, if they somehow survive, with 0 cards in hand. So that on their next turn, they have to top deck a grade 3 to even stride. And if they don't, they're probably just going to lose the game on the spot. Getting into GB8 is kind of hard, but we have 6 ways to G-Guardian in this deck, so it's slightly easier for us than it would be for another deck, which is good to know. And this is another stride that we can go into when we've been damage denied, because we can pay Soul Blast for the discard effect if we have to. So this is another card that pairs really well with a double Restander play. It's just another great finisher in a deck that has a really good late game. You could consider changing this out for something that helps better in the early game, or for another G-Guardian, or for a copy of Cyclone to give your dominate attacks a little bit of extra power. But I personally really like this spot. It's just another great way to finish the game off. And it's another stride that's good against Grand Blue. And then we have our G-Guardians, which I will lay out entirely because G-Guardians are packaged and should be considered together. First off, we have 1 copy of Gando Kurikan. This is 30k shield if the opponent has 6 cards in hand. So you just go into this when you don't want to spend resources and the opponent has a decently sized hand. Next, we have 1 copy of Gehurikan. This is the Dominate G-Guardian. For Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, you pick a grade 1 in the back row and you move it to G and dominate it. This is really good for beating certain attack patterns, especially ones where the opponent swings with 1 column and they have a booster in their other column. If you can take that booster and dominate it and move it to G, sometimes you can make 2 attacks not hit, because the other attack will no longer have a booster to hit your Vanguard, especially if you've hit a defensive. Other times you can use this to take out a problematic grade 1, such as if your opponent played a Hanali but didn't remove it from the game because they didn't know you could do this. Or against some decks like the Eugene Premium deck, where they have a grade 1 that they need to keep in play that they rely on for its effect. You can dominate that grade 1 and move it to G to kill it easily. But this card is quite resource intensive, CB and SB, so you can't really go into that often, so we play exactly 1 copy. And the next we have 2 copies of Rikudo Stealth Rogue Moray Lord. This is our best G-Guardian. This is the effect that when it's put on G, you counterblast 1, and it gets 5k shield for each card in the opponent's hand, which, if they have a 6-card hand, is going to be plus 30, making this a 45k shield guard, which will bring your Vanguard up to 58, which will guard basically anything. And then if they have 4 or less cards, you draw a card. So even when the opponent doesn't have a lot of cards in hand, this can still draw a card and maybe draw you into another defensive piece that you need to survive. It's a really solid G-Guardian. We don't have a ton of use for Counterblast, so we're fine using 1 CB on this whenever possible. It's just really, really strong, and against a lot of decks, this is essentially a perfect guard G-Guardian every time. You play 2 at least. I would consider playing a 3rd. If I was going to play another G-Guardian, I would play a 3rd Moray Lord before I consider any other G-Guardian. It's really, really good. And then lastly, 1 copy of Harmonix Messiah. An auto-include in any premium deck. Just get one. They're like $10 now. And that's our G-Zone. The big innovation of this deck really was the addition of the normal unit PGs combined with this split of the ride line. We now can go into Shoujo Doji and get this PG some number of games and slightly inflate our defensive power. We have access to both the soul generation and board development of this ride target, while also still having access to this ride target for additional power and Jakumeso. So that 3-3 split felt really nice the whole week. The only weakness of this build is that we're notably not playing Unin. Unin is the grade 1 that puts the card it boosted into soul and bounces 2 units. Unin is really strong for smoothing out your soul generation into the late game, for protecting your board, and it is also the 2nd best ride target because when you ride over it, you reveal a grade 3 normal unit, and then you search your deck for a different grade 3, and then put a card from hand on the bottom of the deck. So traditionally, you could ride over Unin, reveal an Oboro, and search for a Forbidal to get 2 cards out of your search, or you could do the opposite, and you could reveal any grade 3 and search for a Oboro if you didn't have it. But we're not playing Unin or Forbidal, so we can't do that anymore. And in general, once I cut Forbidal from the list, I no longer felt that Unin was as useful as it used to be. I almost never wanted to ride it. Going into the Crest is just better than not going to the Crest, even though you lose access to the skills of the dominated unit. So really, there's there's not much use for Unin anymore, especially once you have Yamashibukis. I found I was getting cluttered with bounce sources, and so I was just kind of keeping Unins in hand and using them to guard, and that felt like the card wasn't doing anything. So we pretty quickly made the decision to trim Unin down and then eventually to cut it entirely, and I have not regretted that. If I was going to move stuff around to play Unin, I would probably, if anything, consider cutting the Shoujo Doji if I really wanted to play Unins again, but I really like this as a ride target, so I think the list is basically fine. You could try to consider trimming the Zonki to make room for more restanders, because this card is really for like Mega Colony and a couple other matchups and isn't vital to the game's plan. It just helps our grade 3 numbers be a little bit better. So if we were to cut 1 or 2 Zonki, we could play restanders and slightly increase our deck's power level, which would be nice. But I think the way it is basically perfect. This list basically felt like it solved a lot of the problems the deck had. It greatly improved the Granblue matchup. I went from like 50-50 to Granblue to never losing to it in testing, which was really solid. And I beat Granblue once in Swiss and lost to it once. But the game I lost was the game that I G-assisted for 1 and didn't hit any legal grade 1. So that meant that I stayed on grade 0 for 2 turns against Granblue going second. And I still almost had a comeback win, but I just barely died. I was 1 card short of surviving my opponent's bad bounty turn, and they were at 5 damage and didn't have a big hand, so they were probably dead if I got another turn. So overall, I feel like this deck has a much better matchup spread now. I feel like the cost of playing this and is not really that high, so it was worth it, and I like the increased crit count. The increased crit count lets you randomly win unwinnable matchups too, because sometimes you'll just hit crits a lot and kill them. So overall, I think this is our best version of the deck yet. Eugene took it to a top finish. He got into top 16, which was where the cutoff was for this event, and then got sacked out of the game by Highlander hitting OT crit. So we proved that this list is pretty strong, and I am probably going to play either this or some iteration of this for the foreseeable future. And I think you should consider something like this for Shiranui. But I also don't expect people to do that, because it seems that even in the past when we've had good results with our Shiranui lists, people didn't copy us that much. But that concludes the video and the summary of our performance. I played against a lot of bad matchups and still won X2, which I think is a testament to how strong this variant is. I played against like Musketeers and Granblue twice and stuff like that. And the games I lost were either due to G-Assist or the Overtrigger. So I don't feel bad about those 2 games at all. I think this list proved that it's really strong. Well, that concludes the video. Let me know what you think about this new build in the comments, and good luck card fighting.